What if everything you believed about getting old was wrong? That was the question burning in Frank Reynolds' mind as he sat in the dark kitchen, the wind howling against the cracked windows of his old Nebraska farmhouse. The power had gone out again, third time this month, and all he had was a half-dead flashlight, a lukewarm thermos of coffee, and the creeping sense that life was slowly closing in. He was 72 years old, alone, and for the first time in his life, the silence felt heavier than the storm outside. He used to love storms. Back when he was working, they meant purpose, troubleshooting outages, wiring up generators, saving the day. But now, retired and forgotten, storms were just reminders that no one needed him anymore. He rubbed his stiff knees, reached for his phone to check the weather, and realized even the battery was about to die. 1 bar. Maybe enough for a news headline or two. He tapped open a browser, half expecting it to freeze, but instead, a headline glowed back at him: Tesla installs 1 millionth Powerwall, says the grid is dead. A photo of Elon Musk holding a sleek white box, smiling like a kid who just rewired the sun. Frank squinted at the screen. He knew of Elon, of course, everyone did, but mostly from headlines that sounded like science fiction: Mars colonies, self-driving cars, brain chips. Stuff that made guys like Frank feel old, outdated, irrelevant. But something about that line stuck with him. The grid is dead. He clicked the video embedded below, the screen stuttering through the connection, but the audio was clear. Elon's voice, calm, fast, fearless. You're not a prisoner of the utility companies. You're not a prisoner of the grid. You can generate your own power. Store it. Control it. You can take back your home. Your life. Frank leaned back, staring at the black walls of his powerless kitchen, the ticking of a battery-powered clock louder than the thunder. Take back your life. He laughed out loud, bitter and sharp. Easy for a billionaire to say. Frank Reynolds had done his time. He'd worked as an electrician for 40 years, raised a son, buried a wife, paid off the house, paid his taxes. And now he was alone in the dark, eating cold soup and listening to a man half his age tell him he still had control. He set the phone down and looked out the window. The cornfield stretched for miles, silver under lightning flashes, swaying in the wind like old hands waving goodbye. He closed his eyes, remembering a different storm, decades ago. He and his wife Doris had been huddled in this same kitchen, candles flickering, their newborn son sleeping in a bassinet. Back then, Frank had pulled out blueprints of a solar battery system he'd designed himself. Someday, he'd told her, we won't need the grid at all. Doris had smiled, kissed his cheek, and said, you're always dreaming, Frankie. Don't stop. But he had stopped. Life got in the way. The company folded. He took smaller jobs. Then Doris got sick. Then she was gone. Then Eddie stopped calling. And then, somewhere between the silence and the years, Frank forgot how to dream. A loud crack outside made him jump. The old oak tree had dropped another limb on the roof. He grabbed a flashlight and made his way to the back porch, boots crunching across broken twigs and waterlogged boards. The rain had let up. The sky was clearing, and in the distance, he could see a streak of moonlight illuminating the fields. His breath caught. Even in the quiet of loss, the world kept moving. The next morning, the power returned. Frank didn't turn on the TV. He didn't brew coffee. He walked out to the old tool shed behind the barn, opened the rusted door, and stood in awe of the mess he'd nearly forgotten. Tools on hooks, old projects stacked in corners, and in the back, under a tarp, the old prototype. It was his 1984 dream, a homemade solar battery system he'd started building after taking a night course in renewable energy. It looked like something out of a sci-fi film, all wires and dusty panels and parts salvaged from the dump. It had never worked right, and Doris had always joked that it hummed like a space toaster, but it had been his. He pulled off the tarp, ran a hand over the metal. It was ridiculous. Outdated. Dangerous, maybe. But it was also his. He sat on the workbench, staring at it until the sun came through the window and cast long shadows on the floor. Something inside him stirred. Not nostalgia, not exactly. Something more like restlessness. That night, he typed Tesla Powerwall into his computer and spent hours reading. Energy storage. Backup power. Solar integration. Independence. He scrolled through forums, videos, and user reviews, ending up on a post titled, "If my 85-year-old grandpa can do this, so can you." It was a photo of an elderly man standing beside his Powerwall, grinning ear to ear. Frank stared at the photo for a long time. That night, he clicked Request Brochure. The next day, the town laughed at him. At the diner, someone cracked a joke about Old Man Tesla trying to build a spaceship in his backyard. He didn't care. He walked home, boots heavy with mud, but his head buzzing. He pulled out a notebook, scribbled a single sentence, "What if I built a solar system myself?" He added another line, "What if it worked?" Then, underlining both, he wrote, "What if I'm not done yet?" For days he cleaned the shed, took inventory of tools, and started researching wiring schematics again. His hands ached. His back protested. But every bolt he turned felt like defiance. Every screw he tightened whispered, "You still matter." Late one night, frustrated with a failing battery inverter, he slammed a wrench on the table and muttered, "Maybe I really am too old for this." Then, as if summoned, he opened YouTube and found another Elon clip, "Age is just a number. Usefulness is a choice." He stared at the screen, the weight of those words anchoring deep in his gut. Usefulness is a choice. At 3 a.m, he opened a social media account, first time in years, and posted a photo of his dusty prototype with the caption, "Reviving a dream at 72. Let's see what happens." Hashtag SolarGrandpa72. By morning, he had 12 likes. One comment from a teenager in Iowa, "This is awesome, sir. My grandpa gave up on everything. Glad to see you haven't." Frank stared at that comment for 10 minutes. He hadn't been called awesome in decades. He hadn't been called sir in a long while either. He looked out the window, the sun climbing over the fields. The kitchen buzzed with refrigerator hum, lights on, coffee brewing. The grid was back, for now. But for Frank Reynolds, something had shifted. A man he'd never met had lit a spark in him that even a million power outages couldn't kill. And for the first time in years, he wasn't afraid of the dark. He was ready to build his own light. Hit subscribe and leave a comment with where you're watching from. This story might just spark a new beginning. What's one thing that always pushes you forward, even when things get tough? Frank Reynolds was not always a man who sat alone in the dark, chasing sparks from a life that felt like it had passed him by. Once, long ago, he'd been the guy everyone called when the lights went out. Before smartphones, before satellite TV, before anyone thought the sun could power a home, Frank was the man with the van, the wires, the know-how, and the confidence to flip switches and bring entire neighborhoods back to life. He had thick forearms, a chest like a barrel, and a laugh that filled a room like a sunrise. He was that kind of man, solid, present, necessary. But years have a way of chiseling away even the strongest stone, and life, with its sharp edges and quiet disappointments, had done its carving well. He'd grown up in the same small Nebraska town he lived in now, in a 2-bedroom house that had been built by his grandfather with lumber hauled in a horse cart. As a kid, he'd been fascinated by the way electricity worked. While the other boys were chasing girls or footballs, Frank was digging into broken radios, rewiring lamps, and building rudimentary circuits with flashlight batteries and copper wire. By the time he was 17, he could rewire a house faster than most of the union guys his dad worked with. He joined a local trade school, met Doris at a county fair 2 towns over, married her within a year, and never looked back. Those first years were golden, electric in every way. Frank got a job with Mid-Plains Power and Light and worked his way up fast. He and Doris bought a little farmhouse with creaky floors and a leaky roof, but they loved it. They patched the leaks together. Fixed everything by hand. Every crack in the wall told a story. Then Eddie came along, a blue-eyed, wide-mouthed boy who adored the sound of a drill and tried to take apart the toaster before he could even ride a bike. Frank thought life would stay like that forever, hard, yes, but steady, good, full of purpose. But time does what time does. The plant laid off half its electricians during the recession in the 80s. Frank hung on, doing contract work, side jobs, whatever he could find. Somewhere in the middle of the struggle, he started tinkering with a solar battery system in the garage. It was ahead of its time, barely functional, but bursting with ideas. He dreamed of patenting it, pitching it to someone big, maybe even Tesla if the company ever took off. Doris supported him quietly, smiling at his late nights and coffee-stained blueprints. "You're always building something, Frankie," she'd say, her voice warm with belief. But then came her diagnosis, stage 4 breast cancer. By the time they found it, it was too far gone. Frank sold most of his tools to pay for treatment. The solar project was covered in tarps and dust. He was with her every day, every appointment, every terrible hour in those white hospital rooms that smelled like bleach and fear. When she died, something in him shut off. Like a switch flipped the wrong way, and no one was left to fix it. Eddie was in college by then, studying environmental engineering in Arizona, and Frank couldn't have been prouder. But grief doesn't care about pride. It turns you inward, makes you quiet when you should speak, hard when you should soften. Frank didn't know how to talk about pain. So he didn't. He stopped calling as much. When Eddie tried to connect, Frank answered in shrugs and silence. The last time they spoke, really spoke, was 5 years ago. Eddie had invited him to visit a solar farm he'd helped design. "You'd love it, Dad," he said. "It's what you were trying to build all those years ago." But Frank, still bitter, still drowning in quiet rage, had just said, "I've seen enough panels to last a lifetime." Eddie didn't call after that. And Frank didn't chase him. That was the hardest part to admit. Not the silence itself, but how comfortable he'd become with it. The days stretched long, one into the next, a routine built on habit and memory. He'd wake at 6, drink instant coffee, feed the birds, check the same few websites, nap after lunch, and watch old movies until he fell asleep in the chair. No alarms. No demands. No electricity in his life anymore, just flickers. Sometimes, though, something would break through. A dream. A smell. A memory. Like the time he and Doris danced barefoot in the garage, the radio playing softly as he showed her the prototype. She had one hand on his shoulder, the other resting gently on his cheek. One day, people will say, Frank Reynolds saw it coming before the rest of us did. He remembered laughing, spinning her in the half-light of the shop, her laughter echoing through the rafters like bells. Those memories came less often now, and when they did, they left behind a strange ache, like the hum of a machine left running without a purpose. That ache had been his constant companion the past 10 years. It settled into his bones, into the corners of the house, into the empty seat at the table where Doris used to read the paper. He had stopped building. Stopped fixing. Stopped calling. He had accepted the slow fade as natural, maybe even deserved. What was the point of trying when no one was watching? When no one needed you? That night when the power went out again, it wasn't just electricity that failed, it was the last bit of belief that this life had anything more to offer him. Until that Elon Musk clip. Until that strange, defiant phrase, "You're not a prisoner of the grid." It wasn't even the technology that struck him, it was the fire in Elon's voice, the absolute conviction that the old systems didn't have to be final. That we could break away. That the future wasn't something only the young inherited, it was something anyone could help shape, if they had the will. Frank hadn't felt well in a long time. But something had cracked open. Like a circuit waiting to be closed. He dug out the old journals from the attic, yellowed, smudged notebooks filled with sketches, diagrams, and calculations from another life. There were ideas in there he'd forgotten even dreaming up. He stayed up until dawn rereading every page. The language of volts and watts, of currents and storage and sun angles, it came back to him like an old friend. There were tears in his eyes when he realized he hadn't lost it. Not completely. The next few days were a blur of hesitant motion. He searched for second-hand panels online. Found a supplier 3 towns over with a used Powerwall, barely a scratch on it. The price made him flinch, but he remembered the money Doris had left for something that makes you happy. He used it. Guilt mixed with purpose, but it didn't stop him. He called a neighbor to help lift it into the back of his truck. The man looked at him sideways. "What the hell you planning to do with that, Frank?" Frank just said, "Something I should have done 30 years ago." When the Powerwall was finally mounted on the side of his garage, he stood back and stared at it like a man watching his heart restart. It wasn't just a battery. It was a dare. A challenge. A mirror. He remembered something he'd told Eddie once, back when his son was still a teenager, frustrated with a school project. The best circuits are the ones you build after you fail the first time. That's when you really learn. Now, years later, standing in his overalls, sun on his face, fingers stained with grease and old pride, Frank Reynolds was building again, not just a solar system, but a lifeline back to who he used to be. He hadn't spoken to Eddie in too long, but maybe when it was done, he'd send a picture. Or maybe he wouldn't wait. Maybe he'd call. Maybe there was still time. As the sun began to set and the panels cast long shadows on the grass, Frank looked at the glow coming from the Powerwall's display screen. Fully charged. Ready. Alive. Just like him. Frank woke up with a stiffness that no amount of stretching could shake off, a deep ache in his hips and shoulders that reminded him every morning that the body he inhabited was no longer built for climbing ladders or hoisting panels, but he pushed through it, groaning as he sat on the edge of his bed and reached down to grab his socks, the fabric rough in his hands. The simple act of dressing now something that required concentration and a bit of mental coaching, and as he shuffled to the kitchen to make his coffee, the sunlight cutting across the linoleum floor in golden strips, he tried to ignore the thought that crept in around the edges of his newfound determination. Was this really something he could do, or was he just filling time before the end, playing make-believe in a house that had outlived its joy, trying to rewire a life that no longer had? Current, the doubts louder today than they'd been in weeks, pulling at the fragile wiring of hope he'd started to build for himself, and as the coffee brewed and filled the room with its bitter warmth, he stared at the counter, remembering how Doris used to hum while she made breakfast, a little off-key, but always with joy, and he felt a knot tighten in his chest that had nothing to do with old injuries. He stepped out onto the porch with his coffee and saw that the grass was already too tall, the edges of the fields ragged, the mailbox tilting slightly as if leaning into its own exhaustion, everything just a little bit off, a little too quiet, and it made him feel like he was living in a house that had started to forget what it was for, a place built for living that now only held a man going through the motions, his recent burst of energy now colliding with the reality of age, isolation, and time. The doctor's appointment later that morning was routine, just a checkup he'd been putting off, but as he sat in the small, sterile exam room, the paper crinkling under him, the fluorescent lights too bright, he felt like a student waiting for test results he hadn't studied for, and when Dr. Halpern came in, young, polite, and barely older than Eddie had been when he left. Frank already knew what was coming, that careful tone doctors use when they're about to deliver advice that sounds like a warning dressed in concern, and sure enough, there it was, "Mr. Reynolds, I know you've always been independent, but at your age, I'd recommend you avoid strenuous projects, especially things like climbing on rooftops or handling electrical installations." Frank gave a tight smile and replied, "So you're saying I should just sit around and wait to fall apart?" The doctor didn't laugh. "I'm saying be smart about your limitations. There's no shame in slowing down." But there was shame, Frank thought. There was shame in not being useful. There was shame in fading out quietly. There was shame in not being needed, in watching the world reinvent itself while you sat on the sidelines, invisible, a relic from another time. As he drove home, the wind pushing against the truck like a giant hand, Frank found himself getting angry, not at the doctor, not even at the advice, but at the fact that everyone seemed so eager to file him away into a category labeled done, as if people like him didn't have anything left to give, as if usefulness had an expiration date. He pulled into the driveway and saw the Powerwall on the side of the garage, gleaming white in the afternoon sun, its LED indicator glowing like a heartbeat, and for a moment, it didn't feel like just a battery, it felt like a rebellion, a declaration that he wasn't done yet, that he could still create, still build, still fight for a place in this changing world. That night, he tried calling Eddie again. The phone rang 5 times before going to voicemail, and the message was the same as always. "Hey, it's Eddie, leave a message." Frank stared at the phone, his thumb hovering over the end call button, and then, with a deep breath, he spoke. "Hey kid, it's Dad. I'm building something here, solar setup, Powerwall, the works. Thought you might want to know. Might even want to come see it. Anyway, hope you're well." He hung up, unsure if the message would be heard or deleted, but at least it was something, a wire thrown across the silence. He spent the next few days wiring the panels, working slowly, methodically, every bolt and wire a meditation, a fight against the voice in his head that kept asking if it mattered, if anyone cared, if the light at the end of this was anything more than a flicker before the dark. And then, just as he was beginning to find a rhythm, just as hope was starting to settle into his bones like warmth, the inverter failed. It was old, second-hand, and it gave out with a soft pop and a puff of smoke that sent Frank stumbling back, coughing, heart pounding. He stared at the dead unit, his hands shaking, the sudden silence in the shed deafening. That night, the doubts came crashing back. He sat in his chair, a whiskey in hand, staring at the flickering screen of his laptop, watching old interviews with Elon Musk, not for inspiration this time, but out of desperation, trying to remember why he started this at all, and then a clip played he hadn't seen before, Elon on a podcast, saying, "The moment you think it's too late is exactly when you need to start. Most people give up right before the breakthrough." Frank paused the video, rewound, listened again. Right before the breakthrough. He muttered the words like a prayer, as if repeating them could bring the inverter back to life. The next morning, he drove 2 hours to Lincoln to buy a replacement, spending more than he should, but not caring. This was no longer a hobby. This was a fight for relevance, for agency, for proof that he still had power, not just in volts and amps, but in will. When he returned home, he saw a voicemail on his phone. His heart skipped. It was Eddie. "Hey Dad, just got your message. Sounds like quite the project. I've been thinking about calling you for a while. I'm glad you reached out. Maybe we can talk soon. No promise, no date, but something. A pulse. A bridge not yet crossed, but no longer burned." Frank smiled, wiped a hand across his face, and went back to the shed. That night, the new inverter hummed, the system came online, and as the Powerwall charged from the panels above, Frank sat outside, watching the stars blink to life in the vast Nebraska sky, feeling, for the first time in years, like he had lit something in himself that couldn't be turned off. The inner war wasn't over, not by a long shot. But he was still standing. Still fighting. Still building. The air in the garage was thick with the smell of sawdust, old wiring, and rusted dreams, and Frank moved through it like a man waking up inside his own forgotten past, each step stirring particles of memory, the kind that settled on shelves for decades without complaint, waiting for someone to remember what they were worth, and as he pulled down the last of the boxes from the rafters and laid out his tools in neat, reverent rows, he felt a sensation he hadn't felt since his 30s. Not pride exactly, but something stronger, a kind of quiet conviction, the kind that whispered not just, "You can do this," but, "You were always meant to," and as the sunlight angled through the garage window, cutting golden lines across the workbench. Frank could almost see Doris standing there beside him, hands on her hips, pretending to be unimpressed even though he knew she was beaming inside, and he found himself chuckling softly, saying aloud, "You'd laugh at me now, wouldn't you? Building this contraption like it's 1984 again," but the truth was, he could still hear her voice as clear as the day she first heard his idea for a home solar backup system, could still remember how she'd walked over, run her fingers along the sketch he'd made on a paper napkin, and said, "Frankie, you just might be on to something," and maybe he had been, or maybe he hadn't, but now, here he was, decades later, standing in the exact same spot, trying to bring that old vision to life, not because he expected it to change the world, but because it might just change him. The Tesla Powerwall sat against the wall like something out of a sci-fi movie, sleek, white, silent, pulsing with potential, and even though he hadn't connected it yet, he could feel the weight of its promise, the same way he used to feel the tension in a wire before it snapped to life with current, and he realized that what he was building wasn't just about energy, wasn't just about wires or sunlight or batteries. It was about rebuilding belief, the kind of belief that had gotten buried under years of grief, loneliness, and the slow erosion of relevance, and as he cracked open the manual and traced the installation steps with a pen, underlining and circling, he felt his mind start to fire again, neurons dancing in a rhythm they hadn't moved in for years, and it was exhilarating and terrifying all at once, because he knew one wrong connection, one careless moment, could fry the whole system or worse, hurt him, but he also knew that caution and fear had already cost him too many years of sitting still. He decided to document the process, not for fame or attention, but because something in him wanted proof that he tried, that he hadn't gone quietly into the night, and so he created an account on social media, calling it @SolarGrandpa72, and posted a picture of the Powerwall with the caption, "Reviving an old dream, one panel at a time. Let's see if the sun still got some light left for an old man," and within a few hours, there were a handful of likes, mostly from strangers, but also one comment that hit him square in the chest, "You're the kind of grandpa I wish I had. Keep going," and it made him sit down on the garage floor and stare at his phone for a long time, trying to remember the last time anything he'd done had made someone else feel inspired. He worked slowly, carefully, installing the racking system for the solar panels on the garage roof, measuring twice, drilling once, climbing the ladder with more effort than he liked to admit, and though his knees protested and his breath came short, he kept moving, kept adjusting, kept balancing between gravity and determination, and when he finally secured the last bolt and stepped back to look at the clean, angled lines of the panels against the Nebraska sky, he let out a long breath and felt something open in his chest that had been locked away for too long, a feeling of purpose, of creation, of being in motion instead of waiting to be forgotten. The wiring took longer, and there were moments when he doubted himself, when he looked at the tangle of conductors and breakers and felt like he was staring at a foreign language, but then he'd remember Elon's voice in those interviews, that quiet defiance, the way he spoke about limits as illusions and failure as the cost of progress, and Frank would grit his teeth and start again, watching tutorial videos, reading user manuals, emailing questions to forums filled with tech geeks and solar engineers who, surprisingly, responded with kindness and respect, never once mocking him for his age, some even calling him a pioneer, and though he didn't believe it, not really, he liked the way it sounded. One afternoon, as he was working on the system's backup connections, a car pulled into the driveway, and he looked up, squinting in the sun, to see his neighbor Beth from down the road, a woman in her 50s who ran the feed store and occasionally brought him extra eggs from her chickens. She stepped out, hands on her hips, and said, "Frank Reynolds, are you building a spaceship back here?" And he laughed, genuinely, belly deep, and said, something like that, and when she asked what he was really doing, he explained, showed her the panels, the Powerwall, the wires, and for the first time in years, he found himself explaining something with passion, not because he was trying to impress anyone, but because he wanted someone to see it, to understand why it mattered, and when she said, "You think it'll actually work?" he looked her square in the eye and said, "It already is," and later that night, he realized that wasn't a prediction, it was a truth. That evening, as he stood in the garage watching the Powerwall's display come to life, reading the input from the panels, seeing the battery begin to charge slowly, silently, cleanly, he felt like he'd unlocked a secret door in the house of time, like he'd stepped back into a part of himself he thought had died with Doris, and he found himself whispering, "We did it, Han," even though no one was there to hear it but the wind and the machines. The lights in the garage flicked on, powered entirely by the sun, and for a moment, Frank just stood there in the glow, hands on his hips, sweat dripping from his brow, chest heaving from the exertion and excitement, and he laughed again, louder this time, a sound that startled the birds outside and echoed into the quiet of the night like a song. He posted a video that night, his face lit by the glow of the Powerwall, his voice steady but emotional. And he said, "If you're watching this, and you're over 60, and you think your time's up, I'm here to tell you, it's not. I didn't know I still had this in me. I thought I was done. But I was wrong. You're never too old to generate something new. You're never too old to light up your life," and he signed off with a wink and a wave, unsure if anyone would watch, but satisfied that he had said something true. He went to bed that night with aching muscles and a full heart, and as he drifted off to sleep, the Powerwall humming softly in the distance, the house glowing with electricity he had harvested himself, Frank Reynolds dreamed not of the past, but of the future, and for the first time in a long time, he was in it. Frank didn't wake up to the sound of birds or the creak of his knees or even the usual clank of the radiator kicking on. It was his phone, buzzing steadily on the nightstand, vibrating against the wood like it had something important to say, and in his half-asleep confusion, he fumbled for it, squinting through the morning light as he tried to read the notifications on the screen, but they just kept coming, one after another, a flood of messages, likes, comments, shares, and for a long moment he just stared, trying to understand what he was looking at, because yesterday there had only been a few clicks on his video, maybe a dozen kind words, and now, tens of thousands, maybe more, people from all over the country and even outside of it commenting on his face, his story, his voice, calling him brave and brilliant and inspiring and other words that hadn't been used to describe him in years, maybe decades, and he just sat there in his old cotton pajamas, blinking at the screen, heart pounding, mouth slightly open, like a man who had walked into a room he didn't know he'd been invited to. He scrolled through the comments slowly, reading each one like a letter addressed directly to his soul, and they weren't all young people either, plenty of them were folks his age, some older, people who had given up on the idea that life could surprise them, writing things like, "You made me want to get out of bed," and "I haven't felt excited in years until I saw your garage," and even one that simply read, "Thank you for reminding me I'm not done," and that one hit him harder than all the rest, made his eyes sting in a way he hadn't expected, and he put the phone down and stared at the ceiling for a long time, breathing in and out, trying to hold the moment without dropping it. Later that morning, as he walked to the mailbox, he noticed something he hadn't seen in a while, a spring in his step, faint but real, like his body had remembered it could still carry a man who wanted to go somewhere, and he passed the neighbor's fence and gave a small wave, and instead of the usual nod, Beth waved back with a smile that said, "I saw you," and he nodded, feeling that strange warmth again, like the world was starting to turn its face toward him after years of looking the other way. Back inside, the house felt different too, not because anything had changed, but because he had, and when he sat at the table with his coffee, he didn't turn on the TV, didn't distract himself with the noise of other people's stories, he opened his notebook instead, the same old one he used in the garage, and he started writing again, jotting down ideas, improvements, sketches, even titles for more videos, and it felt good, purposeful, alive. He called Eddie that afternoon, not expecting him to answer but hoping he would, and when the line picked up and his son's voice came through, tired but familiar, Frank smiled before he even said a word. "Hey Dad," Eddie said. "You blew up the internet." Frank laughed. "Yeah, I noticed. You see that garage of mine? Not bad for an old coot." "Not bad at all," Eddie replied, and there was a long silence after that, not awkward, just full, like both men were holding something fragile and didn't want to drop it. Finally Frank said, "You ever think I should have followed through on that old patent idea? The one I had back when you were in high school?" Eddie didn't hesitate. "All the time. I told my classmates you were the first person I knew who saw the future coming. Nobody believed me. That caught Frank off guard. He'd never known Eddie said that, never knew his son had looked up to him in that way, and it made him sit back in his chair and stare at the floor, the moment too big to hold all at once. "I didn't know," he said quietly. "Well," Eddie replied, "now you do." They talked for another hour, about solar arrays, battery efficiency, climate trends, and even about Frank's followers, over 80,000 by then, and when the call ended, Frank just sat there holding the phone to his chest, as if the warmth of the connection could somehow soak into his skin and stay there. That evening, he posted another video, this time with a message he'd been thinking about all day, and he spoke slowly, clearly, with no fancy editing, just his weathered face and honest eyes looking straight into the lens. "You know," he said, "for a long time I thought I had to wait for someone to tell me I mattered again. I waited for a phone call, a visit, a handshake, something to say, 'Hey Frank, you've still got something to offer.' But the truth is, that permission, you've got to give it to yourself. You've got to wake up one morning and say, 'I'm not done. Not yet.' And if nobody else believes it, fine. You believe it first. That's enough to start." The video took off even faster than the first, and soon news outlets were picking it up, calling him the Solar Grandpa and the Powerwall Pioneer, and though the headlines made him chuckle, the attention wasn't what fed him, it was the response from people, real people, sharing their own stories, their own projects, their own attempts to reignite something in themselves. And it felt like he had unintentionally struck a chord buried deep inside a generation that had been told to slow down. Step aside, fade quietly. Messages poured in, veterans rebuilding sheds, widows planting gardens, retirees learning to code, and each story reminded him that this wasn't just about electricity anymore, it was about energy, the human kind, the stubborn, brilliant spark that refuses to die. He even got a handwritten letter from a woman in Ohio who had lost her husband the previous year and said she hadn't left her house in 6 months, but after watching his video, she bought a paint set online and started painting the view from her porch, and included a small watercolor of her backyard, taped to the letter with the note, "You reminded me I still have eyes to see it." Frank held that letter like it was treasure, placed it in a drawer by his workbench, and promised himself he'd never let the light go out again, not in his house, and not in himself. One night, while scrolling through his messages, he saw a notification he almost didn't believe, an email from Tesla's public outreach team, short and to the point, asking if he'd be open to speaking on a community panel about energy independence, not as a tech expert, but as a real-life story of what the Powerwall had enabled for an average American home. Frank stared at the message for a long time, then read it again, then laughed so hard he had to sit down. Him, Frank Reynolds, on a panel with Tesla. He typed out a reply, hands shaking slightly, and hit send before he could change his mind. The next morning, a confirmation arrived, and with it a date and location, Austin, Texas, 2 months from now. He stood in the garage looking at the Powerwall, the same one he'd installed with his own hands, and whispered, "Well, Elon, I guess this thing really did change my life," and for the first time, it didn't feel like a story he was watching from the outside, it felt like he was the one writing it. He started making plans, started researching flights, even called Beth to ask if she'd feed his cat while he was gone, and she said, "Of course. You better go show those tech folks what Nebraska grit looks like," and he smiled because somewhere along the line, he'd stopped thinking of himself as invisible. He was being seen now. Heard. And more importantly, he had given himself permission to matter again. That night, as he sat outside, the stars blinking overhead, the gentle hum of the solar system behind him and the future wide open in front of him, Frank whispered thank you, not to Elon Musk, not to Tesla, not even to the internet, but to the small voice inside him that refused to stay quiet, that pushed back against the darkness and said, "Get up. Try again. You still have time." And that voice, more than any invention or battery, was the spark that had brought him back to life. The invitation sat printed on Frank's kitchen table for 3 days before he touched it again, the paper thick and smooth, the Tesla logo embossed at the top in that sleek, almost futuristic font that made everything seem a little more serious than he was ready for, and every time he walked past it, something inside him would flicker, part fear, part pride, part disbelief. And though he kept telling himself it was just a community panel, just a group of people sitting around talking about solar power and home energy, he knew it was more than that, knew it the way a man knows when a moment in life is trying to hand him a second chance with both hands and all he has to do is take it, and yet the weight of it sat heavy on his chest, because Austin wasn't just a flight away, it was a leap into a world of younger minds, fast talkers, tech innovators, people who thought in lines of code and lived in the future, and he couldn't help but wonder what a 72-year-old from Nebraska had to offer that kind of room. Still, every morning he checked his inbox to see if the offer had been withdrawn, and every morning it was still there, waiting, as if the universe was holding its breath and saying, "Go on then." He finally responded on the fourth morning, sitting down with his coffee and typing out a simple reply, "Count me in. Let me know what you need from me." Less than an hour later, a reply landed, itinerary, hotel arrangements, even a pre-call with a coordinator named Haley who sounded young, cheerful, and slightly amazed when she spoke to him. "Mr. Reynolds, your video's been a huge hit around here. You've kind of become, well, a symbol." Frank raised an eyebrow. "A symbol of what? Old men messing around in garages?" She laughed gently, not patronizing but genuine. "No. A symbol of what it means to still try. To still build. People see themselves in you, or who they want to be." Frank wasn't sure what to say to that, so he just muttered something about looking forward to it and hung up before his heart gave away how much that meant to him. The days leading up to the trip passed quickly, filled with preparations he hadn't made in years, dusting off an old suitcase, buying a new button-up shirt that didn't smell like motor oil, trimming his beard a little more carefully than usual, even calling Eddie to ask if he had any advice for talking to tech folks, and his son just laughed and said, "Just be you, Dad. That's why they want you." The morning of the flight, Frank stood outside the Lincoln Airport watching the planes taxi across the tarmac, and for a moment, he was transported back to his 20s, back when he and Doris used to talk about traveling, about seeing the country by train or plane or camper, and though they never got to all the places they dreamed of, this trip felt like it had all the weight of those old promises riding on it, and when he finally boarded, when the seatbelt clicked and the engines roared and the land fell away beneath him, he felt something in him rise too, something he hadn't expected to feel again, the thrill of movement, of possibility. Austin greeted him with heat, bustle, and that unmistakable sense that the future was being built around every corner, and as the taxi carried him downtown past murals, food trucks, and shimmering glass buildings, Frank kept his eyes wide, absorbing it all, feeling at once like a visitor and a pioneer, like a man stepping through a door he hadn't known was still open. The hotel was sleek and modern, all glass and polished wood, and the young woman at the desk handed him a welcome packet and said, "We're really excited to have you here, Mr. Reynolds," and it struck him again, that odd sense of being seen, not out of pity or nostalgia, but out of genuine interest, like somehow, simply by refusing to stay invisible, he had turned himself into something rare. That night, alone in the room with its floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city, Frank sat in the armchair and stared at the skyline, thinking about the journey that had brought him here. Not just the garage, the Powerwall, or the videos, but the nights spent in silence, the years of routine that had dulled him like a blade left in the drawer too long, and now here he was, on the edge of something, about to speak in a room full of experts and innovators and people who used to seem so far away from the man he thought he'd become, and yet now, all he could feel was readiness. The next day arrived fast and hot, the Texas sun pouring through the glass walls of the Tesla Innovation Hall like liquid fire, and when Frank arrived at the venue, wearing his best shirt and holding the small notepad he'd brought with a few scribbled points, he was immediately greeted by a team of smiling young people in polo shirts with lanyards and clipboards, who ushered him backstage and gave him a brief rundown of the schedule. There were 4 speakers before him, an energy policy advisor, a university researcher, a startup founder, and then, him, Frank Reynolds, homeowner, solar enthusiast, retired machinist, and unexpected internet sensation, which made him laugh when they said it aloud. He waited in the wings, listening to the others speak, nodding at the terms he recognized, letting the others float by, not intimidated but intrigued, and then his name was called, and the applause that greeted him was loud, warm and real. He stepped onto the stage, blinking against the lights, scanning the faces in the audience, hundreds of them, and then he found one, Eddie, sitting near the back, arms crossed, smiling, and in that moment, everything clicked into place. He took a breath, adjusted the mic, and began. "I'm not a scientist," he said. "I'm not an engineer. I'm just a guy who got tired of waiting to feel alive again." He told them about the garage, the Powerwall, the video. He talked about Doris, about aging, about feeling invisible, and about what happened the moment he decided to act anyway. He shared how it felt to reconnect with his son, to hear from strangers who saw themselves in his second chance, and how none of it would have happened if he hadn't gotten mad enough, mad at sitting still, mad at waiting for permission to matter. "You all build the future," he said, his voice steady now, rising a little. "But don't forget about us, those of us who still have time left, still have fire, even if the world thinks we're done. Because the truth is, you don't retire from purpose. You don't age out of meaning." The standing ovation surprised him. It lasted longer than he could have imagined. He stood there, humbled and a little dazed, and then stepped down into a sea of handshakes, cameras, and questions, none of which mattered as much as the hug he got from Eddie in the hallway afterward. "Proud of you, Dad," his son whispered. "You made them listen." That night, back at the hotel, Frank sat on the bed, phone in hand, recording one more video. "I don't care if you're 70 or 90 or somewhere in between," he said. "You've got something in you that the world still needs. Don't wait for the invitation. Just show up. Start in the garage, if you have to. That's where I started. That's where I found out I wasn't finished." He paused, smiled, and added, "And who knows? You might just end up in Austin." Frank didn't remember much about the walk back to his seat after speaking, just the sensation of warm applause in his ears, the buzz of adrenaline still coursing through his hands, and the soft slap of his shoes on the polished floor of the auditorium. But what he did remember, clear as glass, was the look on Eddie's face as he returned to his row, not just pride, but something softer behind it, maybe forgiveness, or admiration, or both, and as Frank sat down and let his breath catch up with him, he felt something inside shift, like a door that had been locked for decades clicking open without force. The rest of the panel went by in a blur, questions about energy storage, grid resilience, climate equity, and while Frank couldn't match the jargon of the other panelists, he noticed something strange. They kept turning to him, not just for nods or anecdotes, but for perspective, as if his voice had earned equal weight in a room full of people whose resumes probably ran 10 pages long, and at one point, the moderator even asked him directly, "Frank, what would you say to someone who thinks they're too old to be part of this transition?" He didn't hesitate. "I'd say transitions need anchors too. You can't build a future without remembering where you came from. And sometimes, experience is the blueprint." That got a round of applause all its own. Afterward, there was a reception in the wide-open hall near the exhibit booths, with trays of hors d'oeuvres that Frank couldn't pronounce, and drinks with names like Solar Sunrise, and Gridtini, and though the noise of clinking glasses and mingling voices made him feel a bit like a barn cat in a jazz club, he stood near one of the tall tables, sipping club soda and fielding questions from people who came up to shake his hand, including a woman from MIT who asked if she could use his story in a lecture on community energy adoption, and a tall man in a leather jacket who introduced himself as a Tesla installation manager from Phoenix and said, "We need more Franks. Any chance you'd come speak to our team?" Frank just laughed. "You sure they want a retired machinist talking shop?" The man grinned. "They want a reason to care. You give them that." But it wasn't all flattery and small talk. As the crowd shifted and thinned, Frank found himself leaning against a pillar near the back of the room, finally alone for a moment, letting his shoulders drop as he looked out over the skyline glowing against the pink-orange dusk. That's when he saw her. Or thought he did. Across the room, near the buffet table, was a woman, white hair pulled into a neat twist, bright blue blouse, posture proud but relaxed, and something about the tilt of her head, the way she was holding a wine glass and nodding as someone spoke, made Frank's breath catch. Doris? No. Of course not. But for a moment, just one long aching heartbeat, he let himself believe it, let the grief well up and crest like it had the first week after she passed, before logic overtook longing. He blinked, looked again, and the woman turned, and no, it wasn't her, not even close. But the moment had already landed. And it brought something with it. Memory. Not just of her death, but of the years before that, of the fight they'd had about the solar patent, how he'd buried it under bills and responsibility and fear, and how she tried to encourage him anyway, had always seen more in him than he allowed himself to believe. He could almost hear her voice, soft but pointed, "You were scared, Frank." But not trying was worse. He swallowed hard, eyes stinging, and stepped outside for air. The Texas night was warm and dry, the hum of downtown traffic faint in the background, and Frank leaned on the railing of the terrace, letting the breeze cool the heat rising in his chest. That's where Eddie found him, 2 plastic cups in hand, one with water, the other with some kind of craft cola. "You okay, Dad?" Frank nodded. "Just thinking about Mom." Eddie passed him the water and leaned on the railing beside him. "I thought I saw her in there," Frank said quietly. "It hit me out of nowhere." Eddie didn't say anything at first. Just sipped his drink and stared out at the skyline. "I think she would have loved this," he said eventually. "You. Up there. Doing this." Frank smiled faintly. "I think she'd be rolling her eyes at all this attention." Eddie chuckled. "She'd be recording every second of it on her phone and texting it to all her friends." That made Frank laugh, the real kind, the kind that cracks open grief just enough to let joy in too. "Yeah. That sounds right." They stood there in silence a while longer, not needing to fill it, and Frank thought about how rare that was. To stand beside your grown child and feel not just connection but comfort, like you were equals now, like the years hadn't just taken things but given something back too. "I owe you an apology," Frank said suddenly. Eddie turned. "For what?" "For waiting so long to get it together. For letting life shrink me. I didn't mean to let you down." Eddie shook his head. "You didn't, Dad. I just didn't know how to reach you for a while. But you weren't gone. You were just quiet. Now you're not." Frank looked at his son and saw the man he'd raised, strong, thoughtful, a little tired from life but still hopeful, and felt a deep wave of gratitude wash over him. "I missed a lot," Frank said. "But I'm here now. That has to count for something." "It counts," Eddie said. "A lot." Inside, the reception was winding down. People were gathering coats, swapping cards, making plans. Someone waved at Frank through the glass, signaling him to come back for a quick group photo. But he stayed where he was for a moment longer, drinking in the city lights and the warmth of his son's presence. He felt whole. Not perfect. Not finished. But whole. Later that night, back in the hotel room, Frank opened his notebook again and wrote down a single sentence: "You're never too old to write the best chapter of your life." He stared at it for a long time, then underlined it twice. The next morning, as he packed his things and zipped his suitcase, his phone buzzed with a new message from Tesla's community team. It was a thank you note, plus a simple question: "Would you consider becoming a regional ambassador for senior energy education?" Frank read it twice, grinned, and replied with one word: "Absolutely." Frank had always thought of the word "retired" like a closed door, like stepping backward out of a room and having it shut behind you quietly, politely, and permanently. But now, as he stood in his garage again, 2 days back from Austin, suitcase still half unpacked by the front door, inbox full of messages from people he didn't even know existed 2 weeks ago, he felt like something had been flipped on, like a breaker somewhere inside him had clicked from off to on, and there was no going back. The garage looked the same on the outside. His workbench lined with tools, the Powerwall humming steadily beneath the inverter, sun catching on the old Ford in the corner, but to Frank everything felt alive, like the walls themselves were vibrating with a new kind of electricity. He picked up his notepad and started sketching again, only this time, it wasn't just about his system. It was about others. He'd been getting messages from retirees all over the country, people asking if solar was even worth it, if someone like them could actually figure it out, and Frank realized the real energy wasn't just stored in batteries or roof panels. It was stored in belief. People needed someone like them, not just someone like Elon, to make the connection real. And maybe, just maybe, that was his new job. The ambassador role with Tesla wasn't a paycheck, he'd made that clear from the start, but it came with a title, a badge, and a mission. They'd ship him educational materials, connect him to community centers, and even invite him to virtual panels for senior living groups. Frank, of all people, was now on the Tesla outreach map. That afternoon, he drove down to the local VFW, where he knew a handful of his old friends gathered on Wednesdays. The smell of coffee and floor wax hit him as he stepped through the doors, and there they were, George, Pete, Lenny, sitting at the same table they'd been anchored to since 2009, arguing about the weather and the price of grain. "Well, look who's back from Silicon Hollywood," Pete said, grinning. "You famous now, Frankie?" "Only with folks who know what a volt is," Frank replied, taking the seat beside George. "You boys ever think about powering this place with the sun?" That got a collective groan, a few sarcastic snorts. "What, you mean us? Solar panels on our little clubhouse? Next thing you'll be telling us we should start a TikTok," George said. "You joke," Frank said, "but you're the ones paying more for power every year. I installed my Powerwall myself. Took a weekend. Saved me hundreds already. More in the winter. Quiet as a mouse, and when the grid went down last month? I barely noticed." They looked at him differently now, not like a guy selling something, but like a man who'd been to the future and come back with instructions. "Show us," Lenny finally said. "Bring in some pictures next time. Maybe even that thing with the graphs." "The app?" "Yeah, that. The young folks love their graphs." Frank chuckled and nodded. "All right. Next week, I'll bring it all." The seed had been planted. Back home, Frank started designing a basic workshop, nothing fancy, just a 1-hour talk he could give in any senior center, library, or veterans hall across the state. He called it Solar Made Simple, and in it, he explained the basics, what a panel does, how the Powerwall stores excess energy, what it means to be grid independent. He stripped out the jargon, left in the real talk. If you can run a lawnmower, he wrote in his notes, you can understand solar. And if you've ever paid an electric bill, you already know the stakes. He uploaded a preview of the talk to his YouTube channel, now past 150,000 subscribers, and almost overnight, the comments section lit up. "Can you do a version for Florida seniors?" one person wrote. "I'm 76 and tired of these rolling blackouts. Where do I even start?" another asked. Frank realized he was onto something bigger than his own garage. He was part of a movement now. That weekend, he packed up a small projector, printed a few flyers, and drove to the Lincoln Public Library, where a senior tech group had invited him to speak. 23 people showed up. Most walked slow, a few used walkers, but every eye was sharp, every hand steady as they took notes. Frank stood in front of them in his button-up shirt, his Powerwall photos blown up on the screen behind him, and told them the story of how he went from quietly fading into retirement to becoming a voice that mattered again. "It started with a battery," he said. "But really, it started because I got tired of thinking it was too late to try something new." By the end of the hour, 2 men were asking about installer contacts, and a woman with a cane raised her hand and said, "Mr. Reynolds, you make it feel like maybe we're not finished yet." Frank swallowed hard. "You're not," he said. "Not by a long shot." That night, sitting at his kitchen table with the window open and the summer air blowing in, Frank wrote out a plan. He was going to create a network, a grassroots program aimed specifically at seniors interested in clean energy. No politics. No pressure. Just facts, support, and hope. He'd call it Silver Sparks. The name made him smile. The mission would be simple: help people over 65 understand, access, and adopt renewable energy for their homes. Not as a luxury. As a right. As empowerment. Frank made a website the next day, nothing fancy, just a simple homepage with a video, a sign-up form, and a message that read, "You're not too old. The future still needs you. Let's build it together." Within a week, over 900 people signed up. By the end of the month, it was 3,000. Retired teachers in Arizona. Grandfathers in Ohio. Widows in Maine. All of them eager, curious, hungry to be part of something that made them feel alive again. Tesla took notice. Haley from Outreach called and asked if he'd consider co-hosting a monthly webinar for their Resilient Living campaign, aimed at older adults looking to age in place with reliable, renewable power. Frank agreed, on one condition: no more talking down to folks. Treat them like they've got a lifetime of grit and wisdom, because they do. The first webinar aired on a Tuesday afternoon. Frank logged in from his garage, Powerwall behind him, microphone clipped to his shirt, a thermos of coffee just out of frame. Over 7,000 people tuned in live. The chat moved too fast to follow. People asked about cost, safety, installation, backup times. And Frank answered them with the same calm, steady voice he'd used in his first video. It's not about being tech-savvy, he told them. It's about being future-ready. And trust me, you've already survived more than most batteries ever will. That line went viral again. The next day, he was quoted in a local business paper: "Frank Reynolds, 72, is leading a quiet energy revolution, for the generation that refuses to go quietly." Frank cut that article out and pinned it next to his workbench. Not out of pride, but as a reminder of what had started this all: a man tired of sitting still. A man who found power, not just in his garage, but in himself. And now he was giving that back, one workshop, one story, one spark at a time. Hit subscribe and leave a comment with where you're watching from. This story might just spark a new beginning. What's one thing that always pushes you forward, even when things get tough? Frank's small idea was growing faster than he ever imagined. The name, Silver Sparks, wasn't just a catchy phrase anymore. It was becoming a lifeline for hundreds, then thousands, of seniors across the country who felt overlooked, left behind by the pace of modern change but eager to reclaim their place in the world. What had started as a one-man mission in a cluttered garage was now a community, a movement fueled by stories of courage, curiosity, and the relentless refusal to fade away quietly. After the success of his initial webinars and workshops, Frank found himself fielding invitations from senior centers in small towns and big cities alike. They wanted the Silver Sparks program. They wanted Frank. Driving to a community center in Ohio one crisp autumn morning, Frank reflected on how far he'd come. Just a year ago, he'd been a retired machinist buried in regret and loneliness, struggling with the slow decline of his body and spirit. Now, he was a beacon for a generation that had been told it was too late to change. He parked outside the building, a brick-red schoolhouse converted into a lively hub for older adults, and took a deep breath, feeling the cool wind ruffle his gray hair. Inside, the room was filled with folding chairs, a projector screen, and a cluster of eager faces. Some leaned on canes, others used wheelchairs, but all of them had something Frank knew well: a hunger for purpose. He started with his usual story, the spark that had ignited his own transformation. How a simple battery from Elon Musk's Tesla Powerwall had shifted his thinking, and how he realized age was not a cage but a key. Then, he dove into the nuts and bolts: how solar panels work, the basics of energy storage, the financial and environmental benefits of renewable energy, and how to get started. He avoided technical jargon, instead telling stories, about Mrs. Robinson in Florida who cut her electric bill in half, about Jim from Wisconsin who installed a DIY solar setup with his granddaughter, about the power outages that no longer caught him off guard. The room responded with nods, questions, and laughter. Afterward, in the social hour, Frank found himself surrounded by people sharing their own, too old, stories, how their children didn't think it was worth the hassle, how their doctors warned them to take it easy, how their communities saw them as relics rather than resources. "But not here," Frank said. "Here, you're the pioneers." The message spread quickly. Local newspapers picked up the story, TV stations ran segments on silver sparks, and before long, Frank was coordinating a network of volunteers. Retired engineers, teachers, nurses, all committed to spreading knowledge and dismantling myths about aging and technology. He trained them himself, teaching empathy first, tech second. "It's not just about batteries and panels," he told them. "It's about lighting a fire in people's hearts." One of those volunteers was Grace, a retired high school science teacher from Michigan with a penchant for explaining complex ideas with humor and patience. She'd joined Silver Sparks after attending one of Frank's workshops and had quickly become an indispensable part of the team. Grace's story was one Frank often shared, a woman who had put her dreams on hold to raise children and care for aging parents, only to find herself facing her own doubts about relevance and ability. "Frank's program reminded me that I still had something to give," she told a local radio show. "I wasn't just old, I was experienced." Together, Frank and Grace began hosting monthly webinars that reached tens of thousands of seniors nationwide. They covered everything from the basics of renewable energy to how to negotiate with utility companies, how to protect against scams, and even how to create community solar gardens in neighborhoods where roof access was limited. These online gatherings became vibrant spaces where questions were answered with respect, and fears were met with encouragement. One afternoon, during a live Q&A session, a caller named Harold from Kansas shared his story of living on a fixed income, worried about rising energy costs, and feeling powerless to change. Frank listened carefully, then walked him through a plan to apply for state incentives and connect with local installers offering discounts for seniors. Harold's voice cracked with relief. "You've given me hope," he said. "At 78, I didn't think hope was on the table anymore." That was the moment Frank realized Silver Sparks was more than a program, it was a movement of resilience. But it wasn't without challenges. Not everyone welcomed their efforts. Some utility companies pushed back, warning of complexities and risks associated with decentralized energy. A few community leaders dismissed the idea that seniors could or should lead technological change. And there were moments when Frank felt the weight of his own age creeping in, the aches, the fatigue, the reminders from his doctor to take it easy. Yet, each time doubt knocked at his door, Frank remembered Elon Musk's relentless pursuit of what others called impossible, and he pressed on. He was not alone. The Silver Sparks network had grown into a family. Volunteers shared stories, traded tips, celebrated successes, and comforted each other during setbacks. They weren't just teaching energy, they were building confidence and community. One memorable story came from Sylvia, an 80-year-old widow in rural Georgia, who had taken Silver Sparks workshops online despite never having used a computer before. With the help of a neighbor and the program's tech support, she installed solar panels on her modest home and proudly reported saving enough on her bill to start a garden she'd dreamed of for years. Frank flew down to visit her one spring, sitting on her porch as she pointed out rows of tomato plants and sunflowers swaying in the breeze. "You showed me it wasn't too late to grow something new," Sylvia said, her eyes shining. Those moments fueled Frank's resolve. Silver Sparks was about more than clean energy. It was about reclaiming dignity, proving value, and showing that transformation was always within reach. As the program expanded, Frank began partnering with local governments and nonprofits to secure funding for grants and subsidies, making solar power more accessible to seniors on limited incomes. He advocated for policy changes, speaking at town halls and energy conferences, always grounding his message in lived experience. "We're not just consumers," he'd say. We're caretakers of this planet, stewards of the future. The culmination of these efforts came when Silver Sparks received a grant from a major foundation dedicated to sustainable aging, allowing them to launch pilot projects in 5 states, including Arizona, Michigan, Ohio, Georgia, and Maine. Each pilot tailored workshops to the unique needs of their communities, incorporating cultural elements, language support, and partnerships with local senior advocates. At a ceremony in Phoenix, Frank stood on a stage surrounded by Silver Sparks volunteers. Smiling faces illuminated by the glow of a massive Powerwall display behind them. The crowd was a mix of young and old, tech experts and retirees, city officials and everyday people united by a shared vision. Frank took the microphone and, looking out over the audience, felt the full circle of his journey, from the lonely man in his garage to a leader lighting a path for thousands. I was told I was too old to change, he said, voice steady and clear. But here we are, proof that it's never too late to learn, to teach, to lead. Age is not a wall. It's a bridge. The applause was thunderous. After the event, Frank was approached by a young reporter who asked what advice he had for anyone feeling stuck in life, overwhelmed by change, or convinced it was too late. Frank thought for a moment, then said, start small. One step, one spark. Let curiosity be your guide. And remember, sometimes the biggest power comes not from batteries, but from believing in yourself. As winter gave way to spring, Silver Sparks showed no signs of slowing. Frank's days were full, emails, interviews, planning sessions, but he still made time for his daily walk around the neighborhood, breathing in the fresh air, feeling the pulse of life in every step. One afternoon, as he walked past a house with newly installed solar panels, a young woman on the porch waved and called out, "Thanks, Frank. You inspired my grandma to make the switch." He waved back, heart swelling. He wasn't just changing energy systems, he was changing lives. And with every life lit up by the power of the sun and the strength of experience, Frank knew that the future wasn't something to fear, it was something to build. The Silver Sparks were real, and their light was only just beginning to shine. The hum of the Powerwall was the steady heartbeat of Frank's home now, a quiet, reliable pulse that underpinned his new life. It was more than just stored energy. It was freedom, a symbol of control in a world that often felt uncertain. For decades, Frank had been tethered to the electric grid, a system that, like so many institutions, seemed to grow more fragile and complicated with each passing year. Blackouts, rising bills, and bureaucratic red tape had chipped away at his peace of mind. But now, the Powerwall and the solar panels on his roof had given him something he hadn't expected: grid independence. That phrase echoed in his mind as he sat at the kitchen table, sipping coffee and scrolling through his latest energy reports on the Tesla app. The numbers were clear: on sunny days, his home produced more energy than it consumed, charging the battery for nights and cloudy stretches. On recent storms when the power grid failed in his neighborhood, his house had remained lit, warm, and connected while the streets outside fell dark. He'd experienced that first blackout just a few months after installation. The wind had knocked down a transformer, plunging the entire block into silence. But inside Frank's home, the lights flickered on, the refrigerator kept humming, and the heater kept the chill at bay. It was the first time in years that Frank had felt truly safe in his own space, unshackled from the vulnerability of centralized power. That moment had crystallized his mission. Grid independence wasn't just a technical term, it was a lifeline for seniors who couldn't afford to lose power, who relied on medical devices, who needed assurance their homes would be safe havens no matter what storms came. Frank began to dig deeper into the complexities of the energy grid. He learned about the fragility of aging infrastructure, the increasing frequency of outages, and the rising costs passed down to consumers. The more he understood, the more urgent his message became. At a town hall meeting in his hometown, Frank stood in front of a crowded room of residents, some skeptical, others curious. "We've been dependent for too long," he told them. "On a system that wasn't built for the challenges we face today. But we have options. We can build resilience right here, in our homes, in our communities. His presentation included graphs, stories, and real-life examples from the Silver Sparks network. He explained how solar and storage systems could not only reduce bills but provide critical backup during outages. A woman raised her hand, eyes wary. But isn't it expensive? What about people on fixed incomes? Frank nodded. That's a real concern. But costs are coming down every year, and there are programs, grants, and incentives specifically designed to help seniors. Plus, think about the cost of being without power, the medical emergencies, the food spoilage, the isolation. Investing in grid independence is investing in security and peace of mind. After the meeting, a few attendees approached him with questions, eager to learn more. One was Martha, a retired nurse who lived alone on the outskirts of town. She'd recently experienced a week-long blackout during a heatwave and said it was terrifying. "I never want to feel that helpless again," she said. Frank promised to help her explore options. Back home, Frank started collaborating with local installers to develop affordable packages tailored for seniors. He pushed for transparent pricing, simple financing, and customer education. He also worked with nonprofits to launch workshops focused on grid resilience and emergency preparedness. Silver Sparks volunteers became local ambassadors, helping neighbors assess their homes and understand the benefits of energy independence. The community response was inspiring. In one neighborhood, neighbors pooled resources to create a shared microgrid, a small-scale network of solar panels and batteries that kept the block powered during outages. Frank helped coordinate the effort, connecting people and sharing expertise. The project received a grant from a state energy fund and became a model for other communities. Frank's own home had become a hub for neighbors seeking advice, with people dropping by to see the system in action, ask questions, or simply share stories. One afternoon, a teenage boy named Jake came by, fascinated by the solar setup. "I want to study engineering," Jake said. "Seeing this makes me think maybe I can help build a better future." Frank smiled, remembering his own youthful curiosity. "You can," he said. "And it starts with one step." Meanwhile, Frank's work caught the attention of policymakers. He was invited to testify before the state legislature on the importance of supporting distributed energy systems and removing barriers for seniors. Standing at the podium, Frank spoke from the heart. "We're not just talking about technology," he said. "We're talking about dignity, independence, and security for our elders. Supporting grid independence isn't just smart, it's necessary." The lawmakers listened. Some were moved by his testimony, others skeptical, but Frank knew change took time. Still, progress came. Incentives for battery storage increased, and programs targeting low-income seniors were expanded. Media coverage highlighted stories from Silver Sparks participants, putting a human face on what had often been a technical debate. Through it all, Frank remained grounded. His mornings still began with quiet walks, his evenings with calls to volunteers and planning sessions for upcoming workshops. He never lost sight of why he started. Age was no longer a limitation, it was a source of wisdom and strength. The grid was no longer a chain, it was a choice. One particularly harsh winter tested the resilience of the systems Frank had helped implement. A major ice storm swept through the region, knocking out power for days. Across the Silver Sparks network, reports came in of homes powered by solar and batteries, neighbors checking on each other, and communities pulling together. Frank's phone rang constantly, people sharing updates, asking for advice, expressing gratitude. In the midst of the storm, Frank connected with Martha, the retired nurse. Her solar system had kept her safe and warm, and she'd been able to check on neighbors, coordinate assistance, and even provide emergency supplies to those without power. "I feel like I've got my life back," she said. "Thank you." Those words reinforced everything Frank had fought for. Grid independence was more than energy, it was empowerment, resilience, and hope. As the seasons changed, Frank began planning for the next phase of Silver Sparks. He envisioned a future where every senior could access clean, reliable energy and be part of a community dedicated to mutual support and sustainability. He dreamed of partnerships with local governments, utilities, and nonprofits that would create a seamless network of resources and assistance. One evening, as Frank sat in his living room, the soft glow of the Powerwall display casting a warm light, he thought about the journey. From that first spark of inspiration watching Elon Musk's Tesla keynote, to installing his own system, to building silver sparks into a national movement, it had all been fueled by a simple belief, that change was possible, no matter your age. He picked up the phone and called Grace, his trusted volunteer and friend. "We're just getting started," he said. "Let's keep building." Grace laughed. "I'm with you, Frank. All in." And so, with renewed energy and a network of silver sparks lighting the way, Frank looked forward to a future where grid independence wasn't a dream for a few, but a reality for all. The power to choose, the power to protect, the power to live fully, it was in their hands. The revolution wasn't just about energy. It was about life, freedom, and the courage to rewrite the rules. Frank had learned early on that true change was rarely a solo act. While his own home had become a testament to what solar panels and Powerwalls could do, the real power lay in communities coming together, sharing resources, knowledge, and strength. The term, community current, wasn't one he'd coined, but it captured perfectly what was happening in towns and neighborhoods across the country. A current of hope, innovation, and resilience flowing through people who refused to be sidelined by age or circumstance. It began in earnest on a chilly spring morning when Frank arrived at a small town hall in Vermont. The place was buzzing with energy. Folks of all ages, mostly seniors but with some younger faces sprinkled in, gathered around tables scattered with blueprints, laptops, coffee cups, and tools. At the center was an ambitious project, a neighborhood microgrid powered by solar panels and backed by a shared battery bank. Frank had been invited to consult on the project, but as he stepped inside, it quickly became clear this was about much more than technology. It was about connection. The community had banded together after a brutal winter blackout had left many isolated and vulnerable. They wanted to build a system that would keep the lights on and the heaters running, but also serve as a beacon of self-reliance and care. Frank walked through the room, meeting people like Marjorie, a retired school principal who had become the project's unofficial coordinator. Her enthusiasm was contagious. "We're not just fighting outages," she said, "we're building a safety net, a family." Frank nodded. It's exactly what the Silver Sparks movement is all about. They gathered around a large map of the neighborhood, marked with potential solar installation sites, battery locations, and shared spaces. The group debated logistics, costs, and timelines with spirited determination. Frank listened, offered insights from other Silver Sparks pilots, and helped navigate the technical challenges. But more than anything, he marveled at the spirit of collaboration. It wasn't just neighbors working together, it was bridging generational divides, pooling diverse skills, and fostering a culture of mutual respect and empowerment. That night, Frank stayed with Marjorie and her husband, who lived in a cozy farmhouse that was itself a showcase of energy innovation. Solar panels adorned the roof, a Powerwall hummed quietly in the basement, and a rainwater collection system fed into the garden out back. Over dinner, they talked about the future. How communities could lead the way in the energy transition, and how seniors, often underestimated, had the wisdom and experience to guide that change. "We've lived through so much," Marjorie said, her eyes reflecting a fierce pride. "It's time to show the world what we're capable of." Back home, Frank's phone began to ring more frequently with requests from towns, homeowner associations, and senior groups interested in forming their own microgrids or community solar projects. He and Grace quickly organized training sessions for volunteers, equipping them to become local facilitators and technical advisors. The network grew, becoming a patchwork of interconnected neighborhoods united by a shared vision. In one community in Arizona, residents collaborated to create a solar cooperative, where members bought into the system and shared the energy generated. It lowered costs and increased access for those who couldn't install panels on their own roofs. In Maine, a group of seniors developed a solar-powered community center that became a hub for education, social activities, and emergency shelter during storms. Each project was unique but shared common threads: collaboration, resilience, and dignity. These successes drew media attention, inspiring other communities to follow suit. Frank found himself featured in podcasts, local news segments, and even a documentary highlighting how older Americans were leading grassroots energy innovation. He often emphasized the importance of mindset. "Technology is just a tool," he told an interviewer. "The real power is in people coming together, believing in their ability to make change, and supporting each other along the way." Yet, the journey wasn't without obstacles. Regulatory barriers, utility pushback, and funding challenges complicated many projects. Some older adults struggled with the digital aspects: apps, online dashboards, remote monitoring, making training and ongoing support critical. Frank worked tirelessly to connect communities with experts, funders, and advocates who could help navigate these hurdles. A particularly memorable moment came during a conference in Colorado, where Frank shared the stage with a panel of Silver Sparks volunteers and community leaders. As they told their stories, a room full of policymakers and energy professionals listened with newfound respect and urgency. Afterward, a senator approached Frank. "Your work is changing how we think about energy and aging," she said. "We want to support this movement." That endorsement led to a wave of new grants and pilot programs, further fueling community currents growth. Meanwhile, Frank never lost touch with the individuals behind the movement. Letters and emails poured in from people thanking him for inspiring them to take control of their energy futures. One such letter came from Eleanor, an 82-year-old widow in North Carolina who had installed solar panels and a Powerwall after attending a Silver Sparks workshop. "I feel like I'm finally in charge of my life again," she wrote. "No longer at the mercy of outages or bills I can't afford. I'm teaching my granddaughter about renewable energy, and together we're dreaming big." Stories like Eleanor's reminded Frank why the work mattered. It wasn't just about watts and kilowatt hours, it was about restoring agency and purpose. It was about rewriting what aging could mean. In quieter moments, Frank reflected on his own transformation. He remembered the nights he spent doubting himself, feeling invisible, afraid to take the first step. Now, surrounded by a network of Silver Sparks and communities lighting the way, he understood that every spark could ignite a current, and that current could become a tidal wave. As summer arrived, Frank and Grace organized a Silver Sparks Summit, bringing together volunteers, community leaders, policymakers, and energy experts for a weekend of workshops, panels, and celebrations. The event was held at a sprawling community center in upstate New York, surrounded by trees and sunshine. It felt like a family reunion, a gathering of warriors armed not with swords but with solar panels, knowledge, and hope. The weekend was filled with inspiring stories, practical sessions, and moments of deep connection. Frank watched as attendees exchanged ideas, forged partnerships, and celebrated victories big and small. He felt a profound sense of gratitude, grateful for the journey, for the people who had joined him, and for the future they were building together. On the final night, under a sky dotted with stars, Frank took the stage to address the crowd. His voice was steady but filled with emotion. "We started as individuals, some uncertain, some scared, some skeptical. But together, we have become a current, a force that cannot be stopped. This is our time to shine, to lead, and to show that age is not a limit but a legacy. Thank you for being part of this journey." The applause was thunderous, but more than that, it was a promise. A promise that the community current would continue to grow, powered by the resilience, wisdom, and courage of those who refused to be forgotten. As Frank stepped down from the stage, he felt a renewed sense of purpose. The path ahead was still challenging, but it was illuminated by the collective light of countless silver sparks, bright, unyielding, and unstoppable. The wind whipped through the tall grass surrounding Frank's home one crisp autumn afternoon, carrying with it a of change, of renewal, of something powerful taking shape. Frank stood outside, hands in his pockets, watching the horizon where his newly installed small wind turbine spun steadily alongside the familiar solar panels. It was the next step in his journey toward total energy independence, a bold move inspired by stories he'd heard from Elon Musk himself about embracing innovation fearlessly. After months of success with solar and the Powerwall, Frank realized that relying solely on sunlight wasn't enough for his vision. Clouds, short winter days, and unpredictable weather could threaten his energy supply. The wind, however, was a constant companion, a force he could harness even when the sun hid away. That afternoon marked the culmination of weeks of planning, collaboration with local installers, and learning about wind energy. The turbine stood tall, a sleek white structure against the backdrop of a deep blue sky, its blades slicing the air with purpose and grace. Inside, Frank felt a surge of hope. This was more than technology, it was a symbol of resilience. The following days brought a flurry of activity. Neighbors stopped by, curious and impressed by the new addition. Some asked questions, others shared concerns about noise or safety. Frank welcomed every conversation, knowing that trust and understanding were built one dialogue at a time. He held informal gatherings in his living room, inviting experts to explain how small-scale wind turbines worked, their benefits and challenges. Martha, the retired nurse from Vermont who had become a close friend, flew in to see the turbine and offer her support. "You're leading the charge again, Frank," she said, eyes shining. "It's inspiring." But progress wasn't without setbacks. Shortly after installation, a storm with fierce gusts tested the turbine's limits. The system's safety protocols engaged, shutting it down to prevent damage. Frank felt a pang of frustration but reminded himself that every innovation came with lessons. He reached out to the manufacturer, collaborating on adjustments and upgrades that improved the turbine's resilience. Meanwhile, Frank's work with Silver Sparks expanded. Inspired by his wind turbine, several communities began exploring hybrid systems, combining solar, wind, and battery storage to create more robust microgrids. Frank facilitated virtual workshops, connecting engineers, policy advocates, and community leaders to share knowledge and best practices. One particularly memorable project unfolded in coastal Maine, where a cluster of senior residents faced frequent outages caused by nor'easters and aging infrastructure. Working with Frank's guidance, they installed a hybrid energy system that allowed them to weather storms that once left them powerless for days. Local news covered the story, showcasing seniors who refused to be victims of circumstance and instead embraced the winds of change. Frank's message resonated beyond energy. It was about empowerment, about refusing to be defined by limitations, whether age, health, or societal expectations. He often quoted Elon Musk's words, "When something is important enough, you do it even if the odds are not in your favor." That quote hung on the wall in his workshop, a daily reminder to keep pushing forward. The growing recognition brought invitations to speak at conferences and community events across the country. Frank shared his journey candidly, the fears, doubts, triumphs, and failures. He spoke about how harnessing wind energy wasn't just about generating electricity, it was about reclaiming control, dignity, and hope. At a national renewable energy summit in Denver, Frank met engineers developing cutting-edge small wind turbines designed specifically for residential use. He formed partnerships to pilot these technologies with Silver Sparks communities, eager to prove that seniors could be at the forefront of innovation. Back home, the days grew shorter and colder. Yet, Frank's spirit remained bright. The turbine continued to spin, sometimes quietly, sometimes with fierce determination during storms. It became a daily reminder that change was a force of nature, unpredictable but powerful. And that embracing it required courage and persistence. One evening, as Frank sat in his workshop reviewing data from the turbine, his phone buzzed. It was a message from Jake, the teenager he had met months earlier, now studying engineering and eager to get involved in community projects. "Got some ideas for improving turbine efficiency," Jake wrote. "Can I come by and talk?" Frank smiled, feeling the circle of mentorship and inspiration grow wider. He replied instantly, setting a time. The next day, Jake arrived full of energy and questions. Together, they pored over blueprints and performance metrics, brainstorming ways to optimize blade design and integrate smart sensors. Watching Jake's enthusiasm reminded Frank of his own youthful curiosity, and reinforced the power of intergenerational collaboration. As winter approached, Frank and Grace worked to ensure that Silver Sparks communities were prepared for the season's challenges. They distributed emergency kits, organized check-ins, and held workshops on maintaining hybrid energy systems in cold weather. The network's strength lay not only in technology but in relationships. It was a living, breathing community that cared for its members. Reflecting on the past year, Frank marveled at the transformation. What had started as a solitary quest for independence had blossomed into a movement spanning states and generations. The winds of change weren't just literal, they were metaphorical, sweeping through hearts and minds, breaking down barriers, and opening doors. One quiet afternoon, Frank sat on his porch, the turbine spinning gently above. He thought about the journey ahead, the challenges yet to come, and the countless lives touched by Silver Sparks. Age was no longer a boundary but a bridge, a connection to experience, wisdom, and the courage to innovate. In that moment, Frank understood that the true power of renewable energy wasn't just in kilowatts or batteries, it was in people, ordinary individuals lighting the way for a brighter, more resilient future. The wind whispered through the trees, carrying with it a promise: change was inevitable, but so was hope. And Frank, along with a growing army of Silver Sparks, was ready to harness both. Frank always believed that the true strength behind Silver Sparks wasn't just technology, it was connection. The bonds forged between people, the support they gave one another, and the shared mission to reclaim independence and dignity. In a world that often made seniors feel invisible, these connections were lifelines. It was during a brisk spring morning that Frank truly grasped the depth of this power. He received a call from a woman named Linda, a 68-year-old widow living in a small town in Pennsylvania. She'd heard about Silver Sparks through a local community center and was eager but apprehensive. Her home had been without power for 2 days after a severe storm, and she felt isolated and scared. Frank listened patiently as Linda described her situation. The fear in her voice reminded him of his own early days before solar panels and Powerwalls had transformed his life. He promised to help. Over the next few days, Frank coordinated with local volunteers and installers to assess Linda's home and install a basic solar and battery system. But more importantly, he connected her to a nearby network of Silver Sparks participants who could provide emotional support, check-ins, and practical assistance. When Linda's system was up and running, the change was profound. Not only did she regain power, but she felt a renewed sense of belonging. She started attending community meetings, sharing her story, and encouraging others to explore energy independence. Her experience became a beacon for those who felt overwhelmed by technology or the challenges of aging. Frank realized that connection went beyond sharing power, it was about sharing stories, hopes, and fears. He encouraged volunteers to become mentors and neighbors to become allies. The Silver Sparks network blossomed into a community of care, where no one faced hardship alone. One afternoon, Frank received an invitation to speak at a conference on aging and technology. The event brought together experts, advocates, and seniors to explore how innovation could enhance quality of life. Frank's message was clear and heartfelt: technology without connection was incomplete. He shared stories of Linda and others, emphasizing how the human element transformed systems from cold machines into sources of empowerment. After his talk, an attendee approached him, a social worker named Paula who specialized in senior care. She was inspired and wanted to collaborate, integrating Silver Sparks energy solutions with her programs for vulnerable elders. Together, they developed a pilot initiative that combined energy resilience with social services, ensuring seniors not only had power but access to health care, companionship, and resources. The initiative quickly gained traction. Volunteers made regular visits, checking on seniors' energy systems, delivering supplies, and providing companionship. Technology was a tool, but relationships were the true power source. Meanwhile, Frank continued to nurture the network, fostering connections between urban and rural communities, younger and older generations, and various cultural backgrounds. He understood that strength came from diversity and inclusivity. One of the most touching moments came during a community event in Ohio, where a group of Silver Sparks participants gathered to celebrate the installation of a new microgrid. Among them was Harold, a 75-year-old Vietnam veteran who had faced loneliness and financial hardship after his wife passed away. The microgrid not only provided reliable power but created a new social circle. Harold stood on the stage, his voice steady but emotional. "This isn't just about electricity," he said. "It's about reconnecting, with each other, with hope, and with life." Tears welled up in the eyes of many in the crowd, including Frank. It was a reminder that their mission went far beyond watts and batteries, it was about human dignity. As Silver Sparks expanded, Frank worked to create digital platforms that enhanced communication and support. A simple app allowed members to monitor energy use, report issues, and connect with neighbors. Recognizing that technology could be a barrier, especially for some seniors, Frank organized training sessions and paired tech-savvy volunteers with those needing assistance. The results were remarkable. Isolated seniors began to feel empowered and connected. New friendships blossomed, and communities grew stronger. Through this digital and personal web, information flowed quickly: warnings about storms, tips on energy conservation, offers of help during emergencies. It became a lifeline that transcended geography and circumstance. Frank also recognized the importance of storytelling in building connection. He launched a monthly Silver Sparks newsletter featuring personal stories, achievements, and practical advice. The newsletter became a platform for voices often unheard, shining a light on the resilience and creativity of seniors embracing renewable energy. One story featured Clara, a 70-year-old artist who transformed her garage into a solar-powered studio. Another highlighted Jim, a former engineer who volunteered to teach others about energy systems. These stories inspired and united the network, creating a sense of pride and purpose. At home, Frank often reflected on how far the movement had come. The power of connection was evident in every call, meeting, and community event. Yet, he knew the journey was ongoing. There were still many seniors unaware of the possibilities or hesitant to take the first step. The work of building bridges, between technology and humanity, age and opportunity, was never finished. One chilly autumn evening, as Frank sat by his fireplace reviewing plans for upcoming workshops, his phone rang. It was Linda. She had a new idea: a community garden powered by solar lights and a small wind turbine, designed as a gathering place for seniors to socialize, share meals, and learn from each other. Frank smiled, the spark of excitement clear in her voice. "Let's do it," he said. "Together." The conversation reminded Frank that connection was a living thing, growing and evolving with each new idea, each shared moment. It was the heart of Silver Sparks, the current that powered not only homes but lives. As the fire crackled and night deepened, Frank felt a deep sense of gratitude. The power of connection was real, tangible, and unstoppable. And in that power lay the future, a future where no one was left in the dark, no one forgotten, and everyone had a place to shine. Frank knew that transformation never came without resistance. As much as Silver Sparks blossomed into a movement of hope and resilience, it also faced formidable barriers: physical, mental, and societal. Breaking those barriers was as much a part of the journey as installing solar panels or spinning turbines. The first and most persistent barrier was doubt. Doubt from within, seeded by decades of being told what seniors could or couldn't do. Doubt from families and communities conditioned to view aging as decline rather than reinvention. And doubt from the broader society, where innovation was often seen as a young person's game. One afternoon, Frank sat in a local cafe in Ohio with Diane, a 67-year-old retiree who had hesitated for years before joining Silver Sparks. She shared her story, the years spent feeling invisible, the fear of trying something new, the worry she'd be a burden if she failed. "I thought I was too old to learn all this," Diane said quietly. "But now, I'm proving myself wrong every day." Her eyes sparkled with a newfound confidence. Diane's story was a microcosm of the broader challenge, convincing seniors, and everyone around them, that age was not a cage but a catalyst. Frank made it a mission to dismantle those limiting beliefs, often quoting Elon Musk's relentless push beyond boundaries: "Some people don't like change, but you need to embrace change if the alternative is disaster." The second barrier was accessibility. Technology, even with its promise, often felt complex and overwhelming. Frank had witnessed seniors struggle with apps, installations, and troubleshooting. To break this barrier, he partnered with engineers and designers to develop simplified interfaces, voice-activated controls, and hands-on training tailored to older adults. Workshops became lively spaces where learning was fun, mistakes were embraced, and support was always nearby. One memorable session took place in a community center in Florida, where Frank watched with pride as a group of seniors, some with no prior tech experience, mastered the basics of monitoring their Powerwalls and solar systems. Laughter and encouragement filled the room, erasing fears one step at a time. The third and perhaps toughest barrier was institutional. Utilities, regulators, and insurance companies often imposed rules and costs that hindered renewable energy adoption, especially for seniors on fixed incomes. Frank became an advocate, meeting with policymakers and utility leaders to push for fair policies, incentives, and protections. His efforts, combined with the growing visibility of Silver Sparks' successes, began to shift attitudes. A landmark victory came when a state public utility commission approved new regulations making it easier and more affordable for seniors to install solar and battery systems. The win wasn't just legal, it was symbolic, a crack in the wall of systemic resistance. Frank also faced personal barriers. There were days when exhaustion and frustration threatened to overwhelm him. The weight of responsibility, the endless emails, the setbacks, it could have been paralyzing. But every time he felt himself faltering, he remembered Elon Musk's mindset: failure was simply a step toward success. If something is important enough, Elon had said, you keep trying until it works. This mantra carried Frank through difficult times, reminding him that perseverance was a form of rebellion against despair. One poignant example of breaking barriers came from a Silver Sparks participant named Roger. At 74, Roger had spent years battling arthritis and mobility challenges that made traditional home installations impossible. Many told him renewable energy wasn't an option for him. But with Frank's help, Roger found adaptive solutions, portable solar kits, voice-controlled energy management, and volunteers who assisted with maintenance. The breakthrough transformed Roger's home and spirit. He went from feeling trapped by his body to empowered by his environment. "I didn't realize how much I'd given up until I got this," Roger said during a community gathering. "Now, I'm breaking my own barriers." As Silver Sparks gained momentum, Frank organized Barrier Breaker events. Forums where seniors could share challenges, brainstorm solutions, and celebrate victories. These gatherings were vibrant with stories of courage and creativity. Attendees spoke openly about physical limitations, financial struggles, and social isolation, and together, they found ways to overcome them. One story that stood out was from Maria, a 69-year-old Latina woman in Texas, who had faced language barriers and cultural skepticism about renewable energy. Through community outreach and bilingual workshops, Maria became a leader in her neighborhood, helping others understand and embrace new possibilities. Her journey was a powerful testament to the movement's inclusivity and reach. In addition to personal stories, Frank leveraged media and social platforms to amplify voices breaking barriers. Short videos, podcasts, and articles showcased seniors innovating, adapting, and leading. These narratives challenged stereotypes, inspiring a broader audience to rethink aging and technology. The ripple effect was undeniable. Schools invited Silver Sparks volunteers to speak, businesses explored partnerships, and younger generations reached out to learn and collaborate. Frank found himself mentoring not just seniors but young activists eager to bridge generational divides. Through all this, Frank remained grounded in the belief that breaking barriers was an ongoing process, a series of small, deliberate acts fueled by courage, community, and conviction. The movement was not about perfection but progress, not about avoiding failure but embracing it as a teacher. One evening, as Frank prepared for a panel discussion on renewable energy and aging, he reflected on the barriers broken and those still standing. The road ahead was long, but the landscape was changing. The winds of change he'd harnessed with his turbine had become a storm of possibility sweeping across the nation. And at its center were seniors like Diane, Roger, and Maria, people who refused to be defined by limits. Frank smiled, recalling Elon Musk's bold assertion, "Persistence is very important. You should not give up unless you are forced to give up." That persistence was the heartbeat of Silver Sparks, the energy that powered transformation. As Frank took the stage that night, he spoke not just about technology but about the human spirit, the spirit that breaks barriers, lights the dark, and refuses to be silenced. The audience, a tapestry of ages and backgrounds, rose in applause, united by the belief that change was not only possible, it was inevitable. And together, they would keep breaking barriers, one spark at a time. The dawn light spilled softly across the horizon as Frank stood at the edge of the hill overlooking the town where Silver Sparks had recently launched a community microgrid. Below, rooftops gleamed with solar panels, wind turbines turned steadily, and the hum of innovation thrummed quietly beneath the surface. For years, this town had faced blackouts, isolation, and the creeping despair of being forgotten. Now, thanks to a network of seniors, engineers, and local leaders, a new horizon was emerging, a future powered by resilience, hope, and determination. Frank's mind drifted back to the early days, to the moment when he first felt the spark, a restless yearning to prove that aging didn't mean fading away. Every challenge since then had brought him here, to a place where technology and humanity intersected in powerful, unexpected ways. He thought about the people he'd met, Diane, whose courage shattered self-doubt, Roger, who transformed limitations into possibility. Linda, who found community in the darkest moments, and Maria, who bridged culture and change with grace. Each was a testament to the movement's heart. This new horizon wasn't just about energy independence, it was about reclaiming dignity and creating space for purpose in later life. Frank smiled as he recalled Elon Musk's words about pushing boundaries, how the impossible was only a challenge waiting to be overcome. "You want to be extra rigorous about making the best possible thing you can," Elon had said. That rigor was evident in every solar panel installed, every turbine spinning, every conversation that sparked a connection. The microgrid below was a beacon of that rigor and collaboration. By linking individual homes and community centers, it created a web of energy that was flexible, efficient, and resilient. When storms battered the area, the microgrid adapted, isolating damaged sections while keeping power flowing to essential services. For seniors who once feared darkness and cold, it was a lifeline. But the project's true power lay beyond infrastructure. It fostered community ownership and pride. Residents took turns maintaining equipment, sharing knowledge, and supporting neighbors. Workshops, potlucks, and storytelling sessions became regular fixtures, weaving social fabric stronger than ever. Frank's phone buzzed with a message from Grace, his steadfast partner in the Silver Sparks journey. "The new horizon is here," she wrote simply, capturing the feeling of achievement and anticipation. Together, they had nurtured a vision that grew from a solitary spark into a wildfire of possibility. Yet, Frank knew this was just the beginning. A new horizon meant fresh challenges and opportunities, scaling up, deepening impact, and inspiring others to join. Plans were already underway to expand the microgrid model to other towns, particularly those hit hardest by economic decline and climate change. Frank had been invited to present at a national energy summit, where policymakers, entrepreneurs, and activists gathered to shape the future. He prepared to share not just data and diagrams, but the stories that brought the technology to life, the human faces behind every what generated. As he walked back toward his home, Frank felt a mix of exhaustion and exhilaration. The journey had demanded everything: time, energy, hope. But the rewards were profound. He remembered a conversation with Jake, the young engineer he'd mentored, who told him that Silver Sparks was changing the way people thought about aging and innovation. "You're building a legacy," Jake had said. Frank realized that legacy wasn't about monuments or money, it was about awakening potential and passing the torch. That evening, at a Silver Sparks gathering held in a renovated community hall, Frank addressed the crowd. His voice carried the weight of experience and the lightness of hope. He spoke about the new horizon, a horizon shaped by courage, connection, and commitment. He urged everyone to see themselves not as victims of circumstance, but as architects of the future. After the talk, conversations sparked around the room, about next steps, new ideas, and ways to reach more people. Frank listened, heart swelling with pride and gratitude. The movement was alive, vibrant, unstoppable. Later that night, as Frank sat by the window watching stars flicker in the clear sky, he felt a deep sense of peace. The new horizon was more than a destination, it was a mindset, a call to action, a shared dream realized through collective will. Aging no longer meant retreating, it meant rising with renewed purpose. He thought again of Elon Musk, whose audacity and vision had lit the path. When something is important enough, you do it even if the odds are not in your favor. Frank knew the odds had never been easy. But they had been overcome, one bold step at a time. And as the night deepened, Frank whispered a promise to himself and all those who had joined the journey. To keep moving forward, to keep breaking barriers, and to keep lighting the way toward a new horizon where everyone mattered and every life could shine. The ripple effect started as a quiet wave, subtle and almost unnoticed. But soon it grew into a powerful current that swept across communities, states, and even generations. Frank watched it unfold with a mix of awe and gratitude. What had begun as a simple idea, helping seniors reclaim their homes and lives with renewable energy, had blossomed into a movement reshaping perceptions and possibilities. It all began when a local news station picked up the story of Silver Sparks microgrid in Ohio. The segment showed seniors confidently managing their own energy, hosting community gatherings, and embracing technology that once seemed out of reach. Viewers were captivated not only by the innovation but by the human stories behind it, stories of courage, resilience, and transformation. Calls and messages poured in from across the country. Letters from seniors inspired to take charge, from families eager to support aging loved ones, and from advocates seeking to replicate the model. The ripple spread into social media, where clips and testimonials went viral. A hashtag #SilverSparks movement trended among those championing renewable energy and senior empowerment. Younger generations, often skeptical of elders' ability to adapt, found themselves inspired and humbled. Frank received messages from college students volunteering to help install systems, engineers offering pro bono support, and community leaders eager to build partnerships. One unexpected ripple came from a small town in Arizona. There, a group of seniors, motivated by Silver Sparks, launched their own initiative. They pooled resources to purchase solar kits and trained each other in installation and maintenance. Their success caught the attention of a local university, which partnered with them to conduct research on aging and renewable energy adoption. The project attracted grants and expanded into neighboring towns, creating a network of empowered communities. Frank was invited to speak at conferences and panels, but he always emphasized that the movement was bigger than him. Silver Sparks is about lighting up lives, not just homes, he said. His message resonated deeply. The ripple effect wasn't just about energy, it was about dignity, independence, and breaking the isolation that so many seniors felt. The technology was the tool, connection was the true catalyst. Back home, Frank noticed how the ripple had changed his own community. Neighbors who rarely spoke now gathered regularly, sharing meals and stories, supporting one another in ways that went beyond energy management. Volunteers coordinated rides to appointments, organized wellness checks, and helped with home repairs. The social fabric was weaving itself tighter, fueled by a shared sense of purpose and possibility. One particularly moving story was that of Helen, an 82-year-old widow who had lived alone for years. She had been skeptical at first, unsure if she could learn the technology or if it would make a difference. But after joining Silver Sparks, she not only mastered the system but became a mentor for others. She organized weekly coffee mornings where participants exchanged tips, celebrated successes, and found friendship. Helen's transformation was a testament to the ripple's power, how one life changed could influence countless others. Frank also saw the ripple effect in the policy arena. Inspired by the movement's success, state legislatures began considering laws to support seniors' access to renewable energy and protect them from predatory practices. Advocacy groups joined forces, pushing for funding and education programs. The movement's momentum shifted conversations from "too old to change" to "never too late to lead." At the national level, Frank collaborated with other leaders to create a coalition focused on senior energy independence. Together, they developed toolkits, training modules, and outreach campaigns designed to empower seniors across diverse communities. The coalition's work attracted media attention and philanthropic support, further fueling the ripple. But the ripple wasn't without challenges. Some communities faced skepticism or resistance rooted in tradition or misinformation. Frank and his team approached these hurdles with patience and respect, listening carefully and adapting their strategies. They emphasized shared values, security, savings, community, and tailored solutions to meet local needs. One notable challenge came from a rural town where distrust of technology ran deep. The Silver Sparks team spent months building relationships, hosting informal gatherings, and inviting community members to ask questions. Slowly, minds and hearts opened. When the first solar panels were installed, it was a moment of triumph that echoed far beyond the town's borders. The ripple effect also reached families. Adult children who had once worried about their aging parents' safety and well-being found comfort in knowing their loved ones had reliable energy and support networks. Conversations about aging shifted from fear to empowerment, fostering stronger bonds and mutual respect. Frank cherished moments when new participants shared their stories of transformation, how the power to control their energy gave them confidence to tackle other areas of life. Some started new hobbies, others reconnected with estranged family members, and many simply felt alive again. These ripples, though quieter, were no less profound. In reflecting on the ripple effect, Frank realized that the movement was not just about technology or even community, it was about changing narratives. It challenged society's assumptions about aging and capability, proving that with the right support and opportunity, seniors could thrive in ways previously unimagined. Late one evening, Frank received a video message from a woman named Carla, a 70-year-old artist living in New Mexico. She described how Silver Sparks had rekindled her creativity. With solar power lighting her studio and reliable energy to run her tools, she had completed paintings she'd dreamed of for decades. Carla's joy was palpable as she shared images of her work and spoke of new exhibitions on the horizon. Carla's story was a powerful reminder that the ripple effect extended beyond survival, it touched the soul. It sparked joy, purpose, and renewal. Frank smiled as he watched the video, feeling a profound sense of fulfillment. This was why he kept pushing, kept believing, kept dreaming. As the ripple continued to spread, Frank understood that the movement's greatest strength lay in its people, their stories, struggles, and successes. Each spark ignited another, creating a chain reaction of hope and transformation. Looking ahead, Frank envisioned a future where every senior had access to clean, reliable energy and a supportive community. Where aging was not a descent into darkness but a rise into light. Where technology was a bridge, not a barrier. Where connection was the currency that enriched lives. The ripple effect was proof that change was possible, slow and steady, but unstoppable. And as Frank prepared for the next chapter of Silver Sparks, he knew the journey was far from over. The current had momentum now, and it would carry them all to brighter, bolder horizons. Hit subscribe and leave a comment with where you're watching from. This story might just spark a new beginning. What's one thing that always pushes you forward, even when things get tough?